Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Erasmus Editions. We are back with session number, or episode even, number 7 of the Help Action video series here on the channel. It's kind of one part interview, one part Q&A, one part topical discussion. And tonight I am joined by a guest who has played on the channel a couple of times. He's got a name for himself in the community. And so I'm going to toss it over to him so he can do his introductions and whatnot. So, Chris, you son of a bitch, how you doing?
Good. Yeah, I'm Chris. I run the channel DropDice. I've been around the community for several years now, running one-shots, campaigns, all sorts of stuff. I've done another session where we kind of talked about the value of Session 0 and why that's so important to campaigns for tabletop terrors. So this is a subject that I actually really like. There's some good questions I saw inside the thing that I'm excited to get a hold of.
Absolutely. There's a bunch of them, too. This one got a whole bunch of questions from a lot of the people from AbTab in particular.
Yeah.
Well, I'm definitely excited to kind of get to those. And it's certainly a topic that I kind of enjoy as well, because I like running both one-shots and campaigns a lot. I think there's a lot of pros to both approaches. And so I'm kind of excited to pick your brain for it, and see where we're going to get with it. Cool. Well, why don't we go ahead and start, I guess, with. Okay, this is a good place to start.
Okay.
So the first talking point that I have is, other than time, what are some of the biggest differences between a one-shot and a campaign?
Oh man, yeah, like time's the easy one. That's kind of the easy thing that everybody understands. It's either going to be one session or multiple sessions, but like there's some different stuff that intrinsically goes into the design of a one shot and a campaign. Like you can touch on backgrounds in a one shot, and you can, if you're good at it, you can tailor a one shot to backgrounds. And there are some really good GMs that do a great job of it inside of AbTab, but like usually it's a little easier in a campaign because you can move that spotlight where you need it. And that's kind of one of the biggest things that I see is how the spotlight is controlled, who has the most time with it, how that time is being spent. Like in a one shot, a lot of times when you move that spotlight, you may be primarily shining it on character A, but you have to partially shine it on character B at the same time and give them a chance to build each other up even more than you normally would in a full campaign. I think that's really where I see the biggest difference for any GM that's going down that path, is figuring out how to navigate those backgrounds and make them more meaningful inside the story that they're trying to tell.
Yeah, for sure. And it kind of feeds into the time issue, but you have more freedom to kind of dive in and explore in depth a character's background and things like that when you have more time.
Yeah, exactly. Like one of the things that a lot of people bring up is like some of their favorite sessions, there were no dice rolls, there were no combats in there. You have a hard time executing that in a one shot. I've seen it done, but like you have to go in with a purpose. The other thing that I've noticed is a big buy-in is players need more defined goals in front of them for a one shot, whereas a campaign, you can open it up a lot. Like if you try to sandbox a one shot, chances are your player is going to burn down the tavern. And that's what went wrong, is you didn't clearly give them enough. So like one of my favorite things to do in a one shot is, instead of having that hook event in the game, I explain the hook event inside my interest post. And then I get players who are interested in my hook event, and I go, okay, let me narrate the beginning here. Here's the hook event. We're going to start right as soon as your characters decide this is the mission that we're taking, because then I already have the buy-in. We're already moving the wheels on the train, and we're going down that track. And that's kind of the thing. The other big thing is like, it's a difference between A to B storytelling, moving down the train tracks and kind of being along for the ride. Whereas in a campaign, in a really well executed campaign, even though the GM is moving that spotlight, what sometimes ends up happening is the lead storyteller actually changes. If you've ever seen, like, Critical Role is a great example of it because of how long it's been going. Most people are familiar with it, but even like the Provokers, you can see when a player takes control of that spotlight and makes a moment their own. It doesn't diminish the GM in any way. It just further adds to the story. And I feel like a lot of times players are more encouraged to interact and engage and take control when they know that there will be a session tomorrow and they're not stepping on anyone's toes, because right now while I'm doing this, Jeremy, you're going to be next up to take it, and we're going to see where your character goes. And a lot of times the characters or the players themselves get excited about what the other characters are going to do when they have their moment. That's actually one of my favorite things about running a campaign is post session, you usually have a conversation where you're like, okay, guys, keep it all in game. Let's not spoil anything. But they're excited to see where someone else's story is going to go, or where someone else's adventure is taking them, and how these two stories are going to intertwine. So, I mean, that's kind of the major differences that I see inside there, as far as like how to run them, how to pace them. That's really what it is, because you can honestly take 2 sentences worth of information and run 10, 20 games out of it, or one session. It's all about how you manage your time. Really, that's the big difference.
Absolutely, yeah. Pacing and the economy of action are 2 massive things that I think are different between the 2 different mediums. And you hit on a very good point about that. It's how much control do you have the ability to give up in the constraint that you're working with. If you give too much, then they're going to spend 45 minutes, talking and interrogating the innkeeper, when you've got, like 4 other things planned out that they're hopefully going to get to. Sorry about the dogs. So yeah, that's I think those are very good ways of kind of illustrating the different feel and maybe even the different requirements for a one-shot versus a campaign, other than time being the obvious one. So I'll go ahead and toss one of the other beginning questions that I like to start with, and that is, how and when did you find the hobby? How did you get into gaming?
I got into gaming when I lived out in California. That's originally where I'm from. I've moved around a ton. Anybody who's known me, I'm like, oh, I used to live there. Oh, this is a cool game store to go to. I started in California, and when I was in high school, I met this guy, Donovan, that became just a quick, fast friend. It was like having a brother. Like, I'm an only kid, so like I draw attachments real fast. So like I latched on to him. His family played D&D. I started with actually 3rd edition. We played like 2 sessions, and then the guy who ran the games for us, Oz, was like, nah, screw that stuff. We're going to play old school. So we broke out AD&D and worked our way backwards. And then we worked our way back forward to 3rd edition. So like I had a lot of fun with that. That was probably right into early freshman year when I first started. And like, it's the same story that everybody gives. We had the 3rd edition book. My friend bought the player's handbook. I bought the monster manual. The funny part is I bought the monster manual before I even knew what D&D was. I was like, this is some cool art. And he's like, oh, I have that game. And I was like, there's a game? Okay, so that's what those numbers are about. Let's try and figure this out. Because at first I thought, because Pokemon was big at the time and like all those card games and stuff, and I thought maybe this is a game where you pit monsters against monsters, and this is kind of like a guidebook or something. Of course, like I didn't take the time to read the book to find out that there was a whole nother game that was involved in it. I was just too encapsulated by like things like the Beholder or the Gold Dragon and like all this stuff. And so we learned the way that like kids in the 80s learned. Like we had bits of the rule book. We didn't pay attention to it. We ran our own stuff. And then we kind of figured out what D&D was from like the older people who actually took the time to read the book, or at least peruse it enough to know what the game should feel like. We're in a unique age because there's a lot of people that are growing up with these just super stellar performances by people who like not even big channels, like some of these small channels, you can tune in and it'll be just a fantastic encapsulating game. And like you and I at our age bracket, like we didn't have that. We had like, Jimmy from down the road, whatever dice we could scrounge together from a couple of boxes. And like, we didn't even have the D20 set. We had like D6s out of Yahoo, and we're trying to play that, or Yahtzee. That's what it is. And we're trying to play D&D with like Yahtzee dice. It was a mess when we were kids, but it was so much fun. And I still encourage people to play that way, especially when they're new. It's like, hey, just tell me what you want to do. Let's not worry about the rules. We'll figure it out. I'm the experienced one. Let me figure out how this is going to work mechanically. You want to do this cool thing where you swing from a chandelier, 100% do that. And that's really what what got me started on D&D was just this love of like embracing more the social aspect than anything. Like I loved hanging out with my friends. And then I grew to love the storytelling that was around it as I wanted to like be around my friends more and learn more of what they were into. So like I started off as a super light social player, and then I became hardcore role playing. Let's set up dynasties and legacies inside worlds. And I went off the deep end.
That's fantastic. Yeah. Third edition, the Todd Lockwood Dragons that's the epitome as far as I'm concerned. I started playing a lot before that, but that certainly stole my heart whenever the designs for the monsters for third edition came out. Yeah, like I played a lot whenever I was younger. Before I really kind of started officially, we didn't even have books or dice or paper. Even it was just sitting around just talking about what we thought we understood about the game. And yeah, I got into kind of mechanics heavy earlier editions with my Scoutmaster, and then later in college in theater, we started playing second edition with a group of drama students, and it was rules and heavy on the role playing, and it taught me the exact opposite side of the game that I had been learning. And then I was like, now I understand what this game can do.
Yeah.
Yeah, the wheels were taken off at that point. So.
I think what finally developed me into like a mature, these are the rules kind of player was running for Wizards of the Coast out at San Diego Comic-Con. Like I signed up for that. I was like, I'm a pretty good storyteller. I can do this. And then suddenly I realized I need to figure out how to do this because there's people traveling from around the world to sit at my table. Like the first year I did it, there was so much pressure, and I couldn't believe that Wizards approved my application to be a GM. And I was just like, this is amazing. But at the same time, I'm just terrified. And like, it was like cram school that whole week leading up to San Diego Comic-Con that year of me just trying to figure out the actual what is Dungeons & Dragons. Of course, it's third edition before 3.5 cleaned it up. I'm going to use air quotes on that one. So like, it was a mess of rules, and don't even start with like grappling or what exactly is attacks of opportunity, because nobody at that table even knew what they were either. Too, like it was just a different time trying to learn with these just complex beyond reason skills, or
trial
skills, but books. Yeah,
trial by fire. Yeah, the skill system alone was pretty complex. Actually, now that you bring it up.
Yeah. Like when you achieve certain ranks, you got certain bonuses for synergy and other things. And like, if you try and explain synergy bonus to people who have only learned 5th edition, they're like, "That's a good idea." I'm like, "No, it's not. Please don't do that."
Like, we don't talk about the dark days.
Yeah.
Oh man, it brings back a lot of memories. I spent a lot of time playing 3rd edition and learning 3rd edition. I wrote a lot of classes and races and things for my homebrew world at the time through 3rd edition, and that's a headache and a half. And now I don't do that kind of stuff very much anymore.
That is one thing that it took me forever to get behind. I'm kind of a rules and regulation person to begin with. Like I jokingly tell everybody, I'm like, my order or my alignment is lawful order. Like I don't even deviate from that. So like for the longest time, once I learned those rules and what they should be, I was like, no, these are the rules. And I'm like, not trying to be a rules lawyer about it, but it was like, if we're going to play the game, we're playing the game as it's written. It's intended to be that way. So I was always super against like making races, making stuff like this. And really it wasn't until like I started playing online that I started dabbling in the realm of let's modify things. Like I would write the world around it, but I would write the world around the rules that existed. DBJ is doing a great series right now where he's talking about writing a world around the classes as they exist and using these archetypes to flavor your world. That's how I used to do world building. Like if you wanted to know what a world that I played in was in 3rd edition, you literally just opened up the player's handbook, read what they said a fighter was, and there was like a nation of fighters over here, and then there was like a nation of elven rangers over here. But like they were these really simple, focused on the rules, and things were very specific and organized. But it was really freeing, actually. I think 5th edition and kind of dabbling into some of the more like wibbly wobbly games like Savage Worlds and stuff like that is what really got me to the point where it's like, okay, there's not a lot of rules here, but they give you the rules to make the stuff, so I guess I got to make stuff. So that's what really kind of forced my hand. But man, it was a really interesting time, because I feel like a lot of people that did come from that 3rd edition era were kind of all in that same boat. Like, we were all in this wheelhouse of, well, WotC is coming out with these rules on high, and they're handing them down to us like manna from the heavens, and we can't deviate. And Adventures League at the time did not help that situation at all. Like, Adventure League now is a little bit more free and a little bit more embracing of storyline. Like, ours was straight up, you might as well have played Magic the Gathering. Like, it was an A to B event, and there was everything regimented, regulated, and 100% through.
Yeah, I still have my RPGA card somewhere.
Yeah.
Tucked in my wallet, I think, at the back.
I was gonna say, I'm pretty sure I've got mine tucked away somewhere too.
I think it's stuck to my open waters certification for snorkeling, like scuba diving. I think they're stuck together.
Used forever.
That's how often I use them. But man, yeah, like, I am the complete opposite. Like, I used to take apart my GI Joes and like rearrange their pieces. Like, I've always been very much about like breaking something down into its elements and throwing away what I don't like, and like keeping what I do, and bringing stuff from somewhere else and adding it in. I've very much always enjoyed that kind of level of customization and hands-on. I feel like I learn things better that way oftentimes.
Yeah, you learn kind of like a different approach, and there are definitely people that do learn a lot better like that. My friend Murdoch is actually a really good example of that. Like, he learns by breaking things down, but then he relearns by using the tools that were used by doing the system. Like, Pathfinder is a great example. We played a lot of Pathfinder. We would find build options that were, of course, ridiculous because it's Pathfinder. And like, we would sit there and we would tweak with them and find out what their capabilities would be. And then we would break it down and figure out what does this mean inside the world? And there was a lot of really good development that came from those kinds of sessions where we were just kind of talking theory.
Yeah, I used to love kind of finally hitting on the pattern that was used to create a class or a race or whatever, and being like, okay, now I understand how to make my own, and feel like, I think that's probably balance, not come to the table with like, hey guys, guess what? There's no reason for any of the rest of you to play because I, created this class that does everything well.
And that kind of stuff has done a really good job of helping people figure that out too. Like, in 3rd edition, I don't think I would have ever tread the waters of trying to create a class. Like, it was so unbalanced that I could have made something unbalanced and it would have fit anyways, but like, it just never felt like a good idea.
A wobbly kind of thing. Well, one of the things that you have brought up a couple of times is a couple of different game systems, and I have a question about that actually. So we'll just hop right into that. So in AbTab, in the circle that we kind of both run in, you are known. Specifically, you are considered to kind of be the unofficial shogun of L5R. So now, the Five Rings is a very different beast than, say, Dungeons and Dragons. But how important is it, in your opinion, for players to experience vastly different systems, and why?
Man. Yeah, I won't go super deep into L5R because that's not the point of this conversation, but I think it's really important for players to try other systems, for GMs to try other systems. I think GMs especially, it's important for you guys to try other systems, because there are things that designers have that are gems inside their game that are buried underneath bad mechanics or bad design. And like, even the worst game that you find, you're bound to find some kernels in there that made it worth your $1.50 purchase on drive-through because it's GM sale or whatever the case is. Like, I have just tons and tons of games that I've pulled from and seen different mechanics and that I love. Like, for example, Burning Wheel, which is a super intimidating game for anybody. It's like a 600-page book that is a lot of rules, very little pictures. It looks like a Bible, basically. But there are some really beautiful mechanics in there that sell how players should achieve their goals in game and how they should be awarded, that are worth the read of that book alone, just on what the beliefs, instincts, and traits are inside that system. Like, L5R has a similar kind of feel where there are certain things inside there. The focus on social and what it means to have honor are so ingrained into everything that L5R is, that it's worth exploring. Because even if you play D&D after you decide you don't like Legend of the Five Rings, if you want to play a paladin that follows an oath, there are bound to be some carryover lessons that you can have from being a samurai who follows Bushido. Even if it's not the same chivalric code, it's a chivalric character in a system that is designed to reward and engage that chivalric mechanic. So bringing that over as a player tool or a GM tool is fantastic. Like Blades in the Dark is a great game. I love that one. And the way that they handle criminals and the way the underground works, like my D&D games, whenever criminal elements come up, have elevated so much so because of thinking about, okay, if they do this for this Thieves Guild, this is the fallout that's going to happen. These are the people that it's going to affect, because that's all that game is about. And it does it so fantastic. So without testing the water and seeing what that's all about, I feel like you're losing a big portion of this hobby if you don't engage with other systems. Even if it's just on I'm going to read it, see if there's anything of value, and then move on with my life. To me, it would be like saying Harry Potter is the best book series ever. I will never read another book again. It just seems crazy to me to think about that. Like even if you go, okay, well, Fantastic Beasts out, so I'll give Fantastic Beasts a try because it's the next edition, but I'll never try anything else. Like that's where I kind of see that D&D forever kind of banner waving, that I'm just, it's not that it makes me mad. It just makes me feel disappointed, because it's like, there's a lot of stuff out there for us, and we live in a great time for that stuff. Like, I mean, absolute tabletop. If you're a diehard WotC person, like I was at the very beginning of third edition, I never would have looked at AbTab because I just assumed that they weren't doing the mechanics correctly because they're not WotC. But they are. And without looking at that stuff, you never know what you're really going to miss. Yeah. Actually, the funny part is the DropDice channel started as a blog where my whole purpose was to try other games and report on them. And then I was like, you know what? I'll just do this YouTube thing. It's easier than typing.
That's true. That's very, very true. Oh, man. Yeah, I don't think that I could agree anymore. It's one of those things where even if you don't end up finding things that you do like to port over to what you do want to play, you at least you've tried something and you've determined that you prefer what you're doing over that. So now you're concreting like your instinct or whatever. You know that you prefer the way that this particular mechanic works now because you've seen other options and you've picked the one that you like the most.
Absolutely. And each one of these games has their own design and tone to them. And sometimes, like, if, for example, D&D being the biggest one, sometimes D&D just doesn't scratch the itch you're looking for. And you can bend it, you can move it, and you can make it do whatever you want because, at our heart, every GM is a designer at some level. But at some point, what you've done is you've taken D&D and made it not D&D. And maybe it would be good to look at maybe something else and make it a little bit less of not D&D and maybe more of something else. Like I have this threshold inside my mind. If it doesn't feel like it's 80% true to the rules, I look for another system. That's personal rule. If like, for example, when you first started running beneath the Banner Shadow, I was like, okay, A Song of Ice and Fire would be fantastic for this. It's a really good game for it, or Rain even. And I even suggested those as things that you could look at for kind of inspiration. And I really like what you pulled because your game still feels like it meets that 80% criteria. Having played in it, it feels like D&D, but it definitely has some edges from some of those other games that have a very similar kind of DNA level identity. So like, I think that's a good qualifier. So if you stay within 80% of the design concept of the original writers, if not, get crazy, write up your own thing. I mean, I'm developing my own game right now. So, I mean, just do what is necessary for you to have a lot of fun and feel like everything is exactly where you want it to be.
I think that's a pretty good rule, or at least a standard to kind of hold yourself to. It's good to branch out on your own if it certainly gets to past a certain threshold. because then you can stop making concessions and you can do exactly what it is that you want to do to achieve the kind of goal that you're after. And like you said, ultimately it's got to feel, you have to have a certain level of ownership over the games that you're going to run. I feel, in order to put the kind of love and attention into the crafting of them that's required to make them good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned that, because it took me a long time to learn this important lesson, since we're talking about campaigns. Is like, when you decide I'm going to launch a campaign, one of the biggest things you need to do as a GM is make sure you love your project, not that the players love it more than you. There are so many campaigns in the past, from myself, from watching others, that it was like the players were really hyped about something, but the GM just wasn't jiving correctly, or maybe had a slightly different idea, and it spells disaster for the campaign. So like, my new rule of thumb is like, for the GM has to be in love with the project if it's going to be a campaign. If it's about what the players want, those are usually better suited for smaller number of sessions, like an arc where you can pursue one idea that you really like from this, meet all the requirements of your players, and then move forward. I'm actually kind of surprised I forgot about that, because I had a note about that written on the side here.
Well, I'm glad that we could touch on it. Yeah, I am not a sandbox DM. I never have been. It's not something I'm comfortable running. I've tried before. And I try really hard not to be a railroad DM, but I am certainly a lot more probably in that part of the ballpark. And I like trying to strike a good balance somewhere between, of having the players kind of direct where they want to go, and then just have like little pieces on the shelf ready to go for whenever they get to a point where that is going to fit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't mean to sound forward about it, but I think it has to do with you having a background in building terrain. Like, the way that you run a game that I've seen inside your stories and your campaigns, it's what a lot of people refer to as like the theme park. It's mostly a sandbox, but when you get to the roller coaster, you're on the roller coaster. When you get to the Ferris wheel, you're on the Ferris wheel. And I think that's a really good, healthy area for most GMs to kind of start and feel what they like. I'm such like all over the place GM. I try to be eclectic in my style so I can appeal to different people and get a chance to play with different players. Like, some games I'll run very straight railroad, and this is our story, we're going to do it to the end. Some games it's everyone's story, or like the L5R story I'm running right now, it's mostly Tyler's story. It's a 6-part adventure, but the other characters are actually just supporting characters to what's going on inside the story. They're phenomenal. They're doing their roles great, but a lot of this is his story. And then other times it's, hey, there's a world in front of you. Do whatever you find necessary. Like, you can do whatever you want. And usually those, from experience, turn into kingdom building games. So if you ever want to run one of those, that's the easiest way to do it. You just give them a plot of land and say, hey, there's stuff out there if you want to go engage with it, because players will naturally gravitate towards their own desires of wealth and accomplishment if you give them nothing else.
Very true. Speaking of the differences between kind of the goals of a GM and the goals of his players or her players, so what is the difference in the approach to a one-shot versus a campaign? For a GM, it's a little more obvious. But what about like as a player? Are there different approaches that you can adopt? For one or the other?
I think some of the most successful one-shot players I've seen, they tend to do kind of the same stuff, which is they come in with a very, I don't want to say like simple, like it's a bad thing, but a simple character that has like a high note that they want to show inside their character for the session. Like inside your one shot that we did for Beneath the Banner, I played a character that I wanted to explore, a character who was heavily religious. I took the time to write out what my prayers were inside there, and that was going to be my high note, because inside the time for a one shot, chances are I'm only going to get one chance to highlight who my character is. So I want to make sure that whatever that is, it's tuned in the way that I really want it. So I usually recommend for one-shots for players to play something that is specialized. Specialists tend to feel the most entertaining and rewarding inside a one-shot. They're fantastic for campaigns, and they can really, really sing in a campaign. But in a one-shot, if you play a generalist who's not super good at anything but is kind of okay at a lot of things and doesn't have a lot of depth until you start to like scratch the surface, that character tends to get washed out and you feel like you're not engaging as much with the story. The second type of character that I see that's tend to be pretty successful is judge your group real quick when you go in. If you see someone who is taking the position of leadership, then a good role for you to go is a supporting character. It's actually my favorite role. I like playing supporting characters. I don't really care for the leadership role as much. I will do it if no one else is. But if you play a character that supports the other characters inside the group, whether it's you attach to one person or you attach to multiple people, you get a lot of interesting little vignettes into who these people are, especially if the other person plays along with you. And it doesn't take much for that to happen. In an L5R one-shot that Taylor Jeffrey and I did, she made her character in love with one of the NPCs. We knew that much going into the adventure. And then she revealed it in the adventure that it was my character. And I was like, oh, let me think about how my character feels about this. And it was a really fun point because she was playing a young girl. I was playing a seasoned warrior who was married and was trying to kind of like not address the fact that this young woman was very interested in him. And it ended terribly because it's L5R and usually there's a bad ending. But it was a really good character interaction that added a lot of depth to our story, even though our story was only about 4 hours. That's really the big things that I see from successful players anyways inside one-shots. The other thing that I see that is successful, and this is purely a meta thing, is know the mechanics you're going to engage with. I don't care if you don't know how spellcasting works if you're playing a fighter, but if you know the mechanics that you're going to engage with, you have a couple spells pre-written, it makes your turns faster, it makes everybody feel engaged, and it makes your character a lot more in depth. Because, for example, a caster, if you know what a fireball mechanically is, when it comes to your turn, instead of worrying about what a fireball mechanically is, you can describe it as blue flames, and it's mainly of helium gas, and it's really more of an explosion than it is like a fireball coming at them. Those elements will breathe life into the character and give it a lot of detail that is kind of sometimes missing from a lot of players' handbooks. Like a lot of players' handbooks, they'll give you the idea of what this ability is, but they don't really go into a lot with it. And that's where we, as the actors on the stage that is our game, get a chance to really get to kind of play with that stuff.
Yeah, Savage Worlds, they do trappings with their different powers and stuff, and it's always been one of the things about Savage Worlds that's always kind of stuck with me, is they encourage you to mechanically take the same power or benefit, but flavor it and reskin it to match a myriad of different, types of characters and settings and genres. So, yeah, I can't agree a lot more than being prepared, like you said, especially for a one-shot, because your time is limited. Just like with revealing parts of your backstory, all of your screen time is limited. So when you get your moment,
I try to avoid the backstory as much as I can in a one-shot because honestly, it's more about the event that's happening in front of us than where your character came from. If that is important to the story that's happening at the time, then it will be revealed. But I always feel like revealing your character's backstory sometimes can feel a little forced. And so it's better to look for those opportunities where it is natural. Like if you're fighting the villain and suddenly you realize that he has the same scar as the man that murdered your parents, that's a good time to bring it up. But like, we meet in a tavern, so my parents were murdered by this guy with a scar. That's not a good time for it. Like, just keep it under your hat. I mean, that's cool. I'm glad you invested in your character, and a good GM will use that quality to make your one shot that much better. But don't force it, because it's going to feel grindy. You're going to be going against the gears at that point.
Yeah, I agree. And I think one shots oftentimes, and this doesn't have to be the case, but I think one shots oftentimes are circled around one kind of a moment, one event, and really the part of the one shot that leads up to the climax is really just build usually It's tension, or kind of like the last moments that are kind of culminating in this climactic scene at the end. And unless, like you said, unless you've managed to work with the GM to directly involve your character's backstory in that one event, then otherwise it's pretty much just a distraction.
Yeah,
it's just going to slow down
it's
the
funny
pacing.
that you mentioned it. I never really thought about it, but kind of when we run one-shot adventures, if you think about the cycle of the hero's journey, we're really only telling about half of that cycle, because almost every one-shot goes build up, build up, build up, a setback, build up, build up, build up, climax, and then epilogue. We're cutting out the entire back end. Like we get the part where he leaves the mundane world, he finds out who the villain is, and then almost instantly jumps to climax a story and then epilogue. And you have to kind of know that that's the flow of the story you're going into to really excel at it. So that's actually a really interesting observation I never really gave too much thought about, because I'm a big fan of the hero's journey and trying to use it. I'm not super good at using it. I'll admit that. Like sometimes I can't, like in a long campaign, I'm much better at using it, but like shorter runs, it becomes very hard to execute. And maybe that's more of the way that we got to think when we're doing these short runs is what parts of that journey or what parts of the story arc that we're building here actually deserve our time. You got to think about it a lot like a director, and you got to decide, is this scene worth it, or should it hit the floor and we should move on to something that is more meaningful? The GM in a lot of ways is more director than they are participant in the story. A lot of times you are setting the stage, but you are also deciding when to start the scene, when to end the scene. And it takes a little while to get a good understanding of it. Like one of my favorite things to do, even in a one shot, is to end with kind of a questionable note at the end. Like there's a little bit of a cliffhanger. There's still resolution for our story, but there is a question that remains. I think that that's a really solid, good way to run one shots, especially vignettes. I know we have a question for that. I'd like to do that one next. The difference between one shots, mini sessions, and vignettes, and how all that stuff plays in, because that's really kind of the key part as far as like GMing this stuff, is understanding how all that stuff meshes.
Yeah, and speaking of the hero's journey, yeah, I run a lot of one shots that are maybe like a quarter of the hero's journey. I like starting kind of already on the path towards the climax. You know, like they've already left their home. A lot of times I'll do things like, you're all members of this, combat group, and you know what you're doing, what you're coming for. Or even starting in media res, where you're already on the way, literally on the way to face the bad guy, and you're deep in the shit already. So yeah,
one of the other things that works really well for this type of style that you have there, and I've seen you run it inside your games, is basically give each character their own hook into the story. Yep. Give them a reason to be there, because then it gives the characters the feel, or the reward really, of having a backstory point that is designed to come up inside that story. I don't do it every time, but a lot of times when I run L5R, because it's such a new system for people, I will say, hey, here are 4 character hooks. These are specific to your character. Please pick one of them and let me know what your choice is when I select you as a player. Because those hooks will be addressed inside my adventure, because I put them there on purpose. If I say something along the lines of, you want this person to marry this person, that will be directly contested with somebody else in the party who wants them to marry someone else, because I'm interested in the scene that will develop between those characters. So that's kind of like a quick hot tip for GMs, is giving players like mini backgrounds, if you would, is really fantastic. It gives you the reward of investing into a character's background without necessarily having to rewrite what you already planned for an adventure.
Yeah, it sounds very similar to what I've kind of become a fan of doing, at least with my campaigns, is like dread style questionnaires. Mm-hmm. I love giving those to my players, and then taking the information that I can glean from those and using that to build what's going to happen throughout the story.
Yeah, Matt Colville was just talking about his game in a conversation with Adam Coble, and he was saying that one of his questions that he asked his players is, what would you betray the crew of this ship for? And he would not take, of course I wouldn't betray the group. It's like, no, your character will tell me that if I was to ask them in character, but like at their deepest core, what would cause your character to turn on the others? And that's such a fantastic game. or fantastic question for a game. L5R has another one that I always love because it's centric to the way that samurai culture is. It's the question of how will your character die? It has absolutely no meaning on the character that you're writing, but it is always the most evocative questions. Players always smile when they see this. They're like, does this mean I'm going to write how my character ends? And the answer is always maybe. Like, it might be how your character dies. Give me an idea of what would be considered an appropriate ending, which I think is probably one of my favorite questions in the 20 questions, because in a way it sets up the goal for the GM, which is kind of worth asking your players in any game. You know, what do you want out of this experience? Since L5R is a game that ultimately is usually about death and honor, that's why the question's phrased its way. But I usually take the 20 questions from L5R, and I've made a D&D version that I use that are like a generic fill-and-fill kind of version. And I actually use a different set that the current FFG uses because I use the 4th edition L5R rules. Their questions are a little bit differently phrased that are a little bit better suited to carry over to D&D. But you get so much depth out of characters when you use those surveys. I think surveys for campaigns are pretty much a must, unless you're doing a campaign to see where things go. Like, I'm running one right now. It's a dragon versus mecha game. It's a concept that we all love, but we're just kind of seeing where the story takes us, and we're kind of discovering the characters as we go, discovering the world as we go. I have some good ideas of what I want going on, but this is very much that theme park feel where I've got a couple of things set up. It's mostly sandbox, and we're just going to kind of feel it out. The cool thing about that approach is your questions that you would have in your questionnaire do get answered generically. They just come out slower. So it is harder to plan if you go that direction.
Yeah, I could see that. Okay. Well, I think the question that you were referring to was the one by DBJ.
Yeah, I think that was who it was that asked.
So yeah, he says, what about alternate game styles, aside from one-shot or campaign, such as episodic, like a television show, or Monster of the Week type stuff, or thematic, like set in the same world but different characters each game?
Yeah, there's actually another question too from Barker, which was personal sweet spots for a number of players when it comes to running one-shots, campaigns, something in between, trilogies, and mini campaigns. These two kind of link together. So I wanted to kind of address both of them at the same time. And then Barker's secondary question, I'll do that one next after that. But there's a plethora of story options in front of you as an aspiring GM or a GM, and you don't have to commit to anything super long. I mean, I've had campaigns where like we sat down, we're like, this is gonna be a 2-year campaign, and 6 sessions later we're like, our story is done, and everybody's agreed that like there's nothing to tell. This story is over. We could do another adventure in this world, but it's over. And then there are other times where, like the Provokers, they sat down for a one-shot. They have 26 episodes in total between both seasons or something close to that now. It's kind of a wild card sometimes, and you have to kind of embrace that. With that in mind, the kind of traditional setups that we typically see are one-shots, which are usually a moment in time, a single event, or something that builds into something else. Those are typically what we call like a vignette, or as DBJ called it, a thematic one. This would be like the one-shot I played inside your world. There's a campaign going on, and we're just a little vignette into it. I like the term vignette. It's a literary term. It means exactly what it means. It's the glimpse from another view is kind of the idea, and it's always going to be short. So I always like thinking of it that style. There's another style that you can go that kind of falls into the same category, which is one that I can't say that I'm super experienced with, but I like the idea of, which is legacy games. Legacy games, the way they work is essentially you run a one-shot that is part of a world, and then you go 5 years later and you run another one-shot, and then you do 2 years later and you do another shot. These are really good for establishing world events. Like if you had a world that was about to go into war, and you didn't want to detail everything about the war, you just wanted to highlight the major battles and make your players be important in those battles. That's kind of the legacy style of game. They're fantastic. I haven't had much of a chance to play them yet, but I really want to work them into this Dragons versus Mecha game because I think that's a good fit for it. So we have our one-shots, our vignettes, our thematics, our legacies, and then we get into kind of the multi-shots, which vary depending on how many episodes you have inside there, what they're actually called. Like there's a duology, which is 2 games, and then there's a trilogy, which is 3, and then you start getting into more and more from there. I think when it comes to deciding how many shots should be in your multi-part adventure is deciding how you want your flow of story to go. Of course, really great advice from everybody who's ever GM'd is don't plan too far ahead in the future. You have to accommodate what your players do in the adventure. What I think about is, what is tonally what I want to hit? How many tones do I want to strike in this story? So for the 6-part L5R game, it probably could have been done in 4 sessions, focusing mainly on the war and the aspects that actually lead to war. But I really wanted to establish who these characters were. So the first 2 sessions were really about who these people are. Why are they important? Why are they going to stop or start a war? How they're going to affect it. The second 2 sessions were actually building up to the war. And these last 2 sessions are the war itself. And then, of course, fallout that comes with it. Those are the tones that I wanted to hit. So in reality, I'm really running 3 duologies in the end, but it's hitting the notes that I want. The idea of notes and beats is how TV designers actually make their episodes. And the idea is it's a story arc structure. You have a hook, and then it goes into development, then cliffhanger, development, cliffhanger, and then climax, fallout, and then setup is kind of the basic format of it. But that can be modified. You can change it. You can manipulate it. And how you manipulate that kind of determines how many shots go into your multi-part. Once you get past that, you start talking about a campaign. And in my book, anything past 6, we're going to call it a campaign. Easy enough. Even if it's only like 7, it's a campaign. You get credit. You get to put that on your belt. But it's one of those things that, like, campaigns you got to feel. That's the best way to describe it. You can write a story arc. You can have a good idea and say, okay, this is the bad guy. This is what they're doing. And this is actually the way that I always recommend new GMs to write campaigns is don't think about your players. Think about your bad guy. What is his story? You're telling his story. Your players are interacting with it. Even if they don't see his whole story, you ultimately are deciding what his actions are or her actions are, or whatever the enemy is. So if you think about what their plan is, what their actions are, you're always going to have story up to the point where you see a natural conclusion to your story. So most of my campaigns, I don't tell people, hey, we're going to do this for like 60 sessions. We're shooting for a year. We're going to go to level 20. I say, hey, this is the campaign I want to run. Do you guys sound interested in it? And then we run it until we feel like it's hit its natural ending. If there's something lingering, like let's say we defeat the first bad guy, and the first bad guy, we've had him for 40 sessions now, but there's still something lingering that's worth exploring, we continue. If it's not worth exploring, I say, hey, here it is. Let's do an epilogue. Let's finish things up and just kind of close out the chapter of these characters' lives. The one thing that I've noticed is when you do it like that, though, players tend to fall in love with those characters and want to see them again. So pro tip from GMs, steal your players' characters for your world. Let them live forever. Let them have legacies. Players love that stuff. Like my favorite time playing with my friend Murdoch is I made a character that was an arcanist in Pathfinder, and I made him a sword mage, which is the worst idea ever. They're really good at spell casting. They're really terrible at swinging a sword, but there was no idea of like the Gish or the spell swordsman so inside the world. So I was like, I want to make this a thing. So I made him. I made a knightly order inside the game, and my character's apprentice was the first. I forget what they call it. It's the actual class that's designed to be magic and swords at the same time. His apprentice was that, and so when my character died and that campaign ended, he left behind a knighthood. He left behind an apprentice who became a master of the knightly order, and there was a legacy inside the world. The next time we played, albeit they were bad guys now inside our story, it was interesting to see how their story developed. It was instant buy-in for me as a player, and for the other players that got to see that story, and for the new players, that weren't part of that story, there was this element of, why is he so important? What's going on? Why do we care about these knights? They're just doing some stuff over there. It's like, no. Those knights are important. I know they are. And that's really kind of the trick to it all is running a campaign is kind of like playing a solo where you don't have music written. You're just kind of figuring it out as you go. You got to kind of feel it. You got to see what mood is. And I wish there was a better way to describe it, but the best thing I can say is prep for the next moment. Don't prep for too much into the future. Think about your tones and think about what you want to highlight. I like to plan for up to 2 sessions in the future because I'm an extra planner, but I really think about a half a session is all you really need to prep for. Whatever you think will take you half a session to do, because your players will fill in the rest. And that's really how I set up campaigns. That's the best way to do it.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for just doing it one session at a time. Is certainly kind of the way that I've grown to start approaching it. Again, I'll have ideas that are kind of set away as when they get there, that,
absolutely.
I want that to happen at some point. But
that's definitely the way I've been about it. Is like, I have a great idea for a tomb in this puzzle. I'm going to set that aside, and when it feels appropriate, I'm going to pull that out, and we're going to use it. But we're going to tailor it to the story that we're doing instead of it just being a drawing that I did inside my notebook.
Yep, exactly. That's awesome. Okay.
Barker had that second part on there, which
yes,
pull it up here. What was that?
Have you ever considered running a game, long or short, for just 1 or 2 people?
I have not. I will say that very confidently. I've been very lucky in the fact that I have players who have always wanted to engage in stories with me. I've never found a point where I felt like excluding my friends, because like the group that I normally play with on my channel, you see them there for about 50% or more of my games. These are guys that I played face to face with. They are people that, like, I wouldn't want to play a game that is Murdoch but not Jeremy. Like that's like where I'm at for that one. I would love to entertain it, but I don't think I could commit to anything super long. Like I definitely have plans for doing one-shots, trilogies, maybe even like a 6-parter, but it's so hard for me to feel like I'm excluding other people from the story. It sounds weird to say that, but like at some level, I'm still kind of a social player, so I like having my friends involved.
Yeah, it's certainly not something that I have done in a very, very long time. But when I did it, it was much more kind of necessity is probably not the right word. But the guy that was running our game in college, he and I were by far the ones who were the most invested in we just wanted to play all the time, any opportunity we had. So there were lots of late nights where we would go to a 24-hour cafe, and the 2 of us would run a game for one another. We'd kind of alternate back and forth and things of that nature, and it was a lot of fun. But it was a very different creature.
I'm a greedy player. I've definitely played in like 1-2 person games and had a ton of fun with it, and it's just, I think if it was like a timing thing and my friends just couldn't make it, and like it was like, okay, these 2 are available today and I really want to do a game, we'll do a game on Wednesday nights when nobody else can play. I think that's the only time that I would feel comfortable with necessarily excluding my friends, like when their schedules stop me from trying to include them.
Absolutely. That actually points very handily to one of the questions that Alan Holloway, I believe, asked. Where did it go? Oh, if you're running a campaign and everyone can't meet that week, should you run a one-shot? And if so, should it be the same system or maybe a different one?
This is a complex question, but it's a very, very easy sounding one for the simple reason of, like, it honestly depends on who's playing inside your campaign. My guys that normally play with me all the time, we typically put the session aside if someone's missing. That's kind of the habit that we've gotten into, unless we're all really feeling it, and then we'll break out a one-shot. Like some of the best one shots have come out of that actually for my channel, like the Easter session where I had the Egg Tyrant and we played Oath of the Frozen King reflavored as Oath of the Egg Tyrant. That was a fantastic game. That was a one shot because someone couldn't make it. The Baywatch game that's on my channel, it's a one shot because someone couldn't make it. A lot of times that's my default, is if someone can't make it, I try to prep like a super goofy one shot in my back pocket for that moment when nobody can make it. I'm like, I really want to play a game. Let's do Baywatch using Index Card RPG tonight. And that's really where we get these like weird ones like on the channel, but they're a lot of fun. And I think it has to do with some of the players too. Like our friend Brendan, I think he's more of like a social player. So if I get 3 people with Brendan, Brendan really comes alive. If I get 2 people with Brendan, sometimes it's a little bit harder for him to speak up because he's not playing towards the other characters in the group. He's playing more of a support person. And then there are other times where like we'll get 3 people together and then Brendan's like, no, I'm the leader. And it's great when that happens, but it's not every character. He plays a lot of breadth of characters. So sometimes it really depends on the group and what they're feeling in the night. As far as should it be in the same world or a different world, I generally like to keep players who are in a campaign away from the vignettes. I let other players play in those vignettes. Just a personal preference. I feel like my players, I give them a lot of central role in my world. Giving them an extra role in the world that could somehow help or hinder their own characters sometimes doesn't feel right. Like I've definitely done that thing where the GM gives them the villain character sheets and is like, go attack this castle and do this evil thing. And they have a blast doing that. But that's like the only time I've ever really done a vignette with the players that were playing in that campaign. The other thing that I feel like is kind of a blessing, if I do a vignette on YouTube, my players can watch it and see the vignette. If I do a vignette with some of the players missing, with some of the other players, it's just word of mouth, and there's something that's missing a little bit from that. And so that's kind of why I steer away from that. Usually we go with a goofy game. It's usually a different system in most cases. A lot of the times it's literally us going, well, we have Blades of the Dark on the shelf. You want to give that a shot? And we just kind of pull it out and we're figuring it out as we go. Anybody who's been following the channel for a long time, if you look at the one-shots are literally me going, okay, I know the rules you guys are playing. We'll figure it out as we go. I got the rule book right here. And that's general, like, fill-in-the-blank one-shots. I think those are fantastic. They provide really great memories with your friends. Maybe not the best stories, but they're good nights. The other thing that's also really stellar is board games, if you can swing that. Unfortunately, being online, that's a little limited for me. But yeah, like when we went to Boston this last year, we decided not to play because we were missing someone that wanted to play with us. We were going to put it off till the next day. So we stayed up all night, played a bunch of board games, and just had an absolute blast with it. I think there's lots of stuff that you can do that's like adjacent to our hobby.
I agree. We have a standing rule with my home group. It's in person, not online. Mm-hmm. But basically, if we're missing half the group, we don't play. We figure out something else, whether it be a one shot or board games or what have you. If we're only missing 2 or 3 people and we still have half the group present, then somebody else will just control their character for the session, and they'll just kind of take a back seat to the RP interaction and things of that nature, and we'll press forward.
Yeah, and it's funny to say it, but like my online preferences are different than my in-person preferences. Like if I'm missing 1 or 2 people from in person, I'll be like, well, they missed the session. They'll have to get caught up, and I'll just keep going. But online, I feel like I want to include them more. And I think it's because online, I try to tell a more, not condensed, but focused story. And so I feel like if they're going to miss 3 to 4 hours of a game, that's 3 to 4 hours of solid content. Whereas if we were at a table at my friend's house, chances are I'm not going to break up their fireside chat about the difference between flamingos and these weird pink birds that they see. I'm just going to let that happen, and it'll be a fun memory. But in a one-shot, I'm going to let that go for, or not just a one-shot online, I'm going to let that go for about 30 seconds. Then I'm going to be like, okay, moving on, goblins attack. Because I have like this little part in my brain that's like, there might be an audience right now. Remember, they're also engaging in the story that's here. So I think at home my preference has changed too.
I am the exact same way. And my group at home plays differently than the games that we play online. I think a lot of that has to do with the interaction, the type of interface that you're engaged with. This has, especially for me, I'm playing on a laptop, so my focus is very, limited. But, when you're playing in person, there's all kinds of distractions and things that demand your attention, especially, being a father. Sometimes I have to get up from the table, and it might be in the middle of combat. I might have to say, okay, my turn is done. I'll be right back. And, go deal with shit. It's just kind of a part of life.
Yeah. I mean, we used to play at the MIT campus, and like literally we'd be mid something and be like, you want to go get a burrito? And we'd walk down to the burrito place and then come back over, keep playing our game. Like it's a little different. Like it's hanging out with your friends ultimately. So it feels a little different than like online, which feels kind of like a performance almost. In a lot of ways, I'm kind of lucky because my friends have adapted and we tend to play like we're in person still, even though we're all online. Which is kind of hit or miss with some audiences. Some people like it, some people don't. But it's our game, so I don't really care. Sometimes it sounds harsh as the person that runs the channel and wants to have viewership and stuff, but like, it's our game.
Yeah, I'm very much the same way. Like, there is a lot of backlash for what's kind of coined chucklefuckery, and like obviously it gets out of hand at some point, and you have to kind of rein it back in.
And
like,
I think there's
okay with some of that.
Yeah, there's a healthy exchange of that. Like if you look at some of the more popular channels, you can see it. Like It Me JP, which is fantastically out there. They have a lot of following. You'll see like the Jesse Cox games. They're complete chucklefuckery the whole way through. They have 12 episodes of it, but at the same time, if you go to the Warhammer 40K playlist, that is a serious ass game. Like those guys could be writing for Black Library. It's fantastic. There is no moment of levity. They are in character 100% of the time. And I think that's good to have on a channel. It lets people know that, there is an acting aspect to the hobby, but at the same time, there's still that warmth that really is what got all of us to love it.
I agree. And I think a lot of it sometimes can come down to obviously the group and the tone and style of the game, but also, like you said, the presence of an audience. At some point, if you don't break that tension, an audience will get burned out at some point. And I think if the levity has context to it, that's okay. If you go off on a tangent about, like you said, flamingos versus pink birds, and it goes on for an hour, that's a problem. Or my personal pet peeve, when you argue with the GM about a rule past like 10 seconds. That's not something you want an audience to have to sit through. It's not comfortable,
Yeah, my guys are really good about it. We were good about it at the table too. Like, we kind of have like a communal, I don't know that that's how the rule's going to work. We're going to kind of work past it. But at the same time, one of the other players is looking it up that's not involved in the scene. And then there's like just a shot of message inside our chat. And we're like, oh, so the rule's on page 93 and this is what we should be doing. And I'm very much about the meta and explaining things as a GM, like L5R, for example. That's new for most people. Hell, it's new for me because it's a brand new edition. I will talk through the mechanics for players, especially on our first run or their first run, because that stuff is important and it's better to have it as a wholesome conversation than it is to be like a questioning, I think you're wrong, this is why I think you're wrong kind of thing. So if you find yourself in that situation, that's how I would handle it, is be like, hey, is that how this works? I don't know, maybe. And just kind of trust your GM, because your GM's ultimately your biggest cheerleader at the table, whether you like to believe it or not. We've kind of moved away from the murder GM kind of aspect that AD&D and first edition kind of brought with them. GMs have changed in tone. They're people who fell in love with being players and decided to be GMs.
Yeah, I know that I am certainly rooting for my players to succeed, even if I'm going to push them to the brink of failure.
Oh, yeah, you should definitely push still.
Yeah, I want to see how how close we can dance that line. But in the end, I do want success, because otherwise the game's over. And that's not fun for anybody. Awesome. Well, we have a couple of more questions that we got from our audience, or from people from the AbTab group that I'd like to kind of get through before we wrap things up. So we'll start doing them a little more rapid fire here.
Okay.
Caius Wallen asks, what qualities from a one-shot would you like to see more of in a campaign, and vice versa?
I wouldn't want to see it all the time, but there are moments in campaigns, and I started doing this actually with Blades in the Dark, and I really liked how it went, so I'm trying to carry it over to my more normal patterns, which is take a session and make that session a one-shot in your campaign. How you would plan a one-shot, plan that session to be. Just take the volume, turn it up, move it quickly through everything. It creates a really fast-paced kind of tension game, especially if you've been kind of sing-songy throughout the whole campaign before then. As far as what I'd like to take from campaigns, I try to do it every chance I can is to integrate at least one person's background into the one-shot, or give them backgrounds to be integrated into the one-shot. That's usually my go-to advice. I already kind of talked about that. That's really rewarding for players. Players like that stuff, so it's good to engage with that part of the game.
Yeah, those are both fantastic examples, and like I definitely, it's not something I've ever really put thought to, but I definitely do design certain episodes of, or maybe even like half sessions. Then I build them a lot more like a one shot. I like having the, intense discussion and planning and trying to figure out how we're going to approach the situation. But like you said, once that roller coaster starts, once you get in the ride and strapped in, we're going to be moving back. And there's not going to be a lot of time to stop and discuss, hey, how do we do this? How do we want to proceed? It's, you can talk about it, but you've got, 15 seconds to make a decision, or you're going to be bypassed. Because it makes the action so much more palpable. It's tense, and that's the way action should be, in my opinion, to give it stakes. Cool. All right. We have a couple other questions from Alan Holloway.
Yeah, he's got some good ones.
The first one that we have not approached yet: are there systems better suited for one-shot versus campaign?
Absolutely. There is a very easy kind of identifier to find out if your game is designed for episodic or one-shot adventures, or if it's designed for campaigns. The way you do that is look at how players are rewarded. If players are rewarded for accomplishing tasks, those are really well suited for episodic and one-shots. If your players are rewarded for goals, which could be a long stretch of things, or working towards those goals, those are more geared towards campaign. On the flip side, when experience is rewarded, if experience is a checkbox item, like I made enough, I can now go to level 3. D&D is the best example for that. That is typically, and I say typically because we as GMs make some changes to the way D&D works to be able to do campaigns, for one-shots and episodic adventures. The reason for my argument on that is simply, if you look at some of the bigger shows that are more successful, the games that you've been in the past that have been successful, the way a lot of GMs tend to run those is, this is our story right now. Once that story's been encapsulated, we're going to move to this story, and then we're going to move to this story. The tier system in D&D is a really good indicator that they had an idea of episodic play with it. Whereas if you look at a game that uses, like Genesis, for example, or Burning Wheel, where it's a system where you're going to get some experience and then you can raise certain things, but there's not a necessarily like a pre-planned route for you. Those typically are geared a little bit more towards campaign play, especially if the way they are designed in their rewarding structure is to reward you for how you play in the session. The most clear example I can give on this is Dungeon World. When you get to the end of an adventure on Dungeon World, and if you run a one-shot of Dungeon World, you should do the experience one time just to see how all this works, is you ask a series of questions. The questions at the end are like, did we find a notable treasure or fight a notable monster this session? Yes. Okay, you get experience. Did we do this? Yes, you get experience. Did you face your bonds or portray your goals, your attachments to each other on screen? Okay, you get this. Dungeon World, in a lot of ways, feels like it's probably an episodic game system, but if you look at it, it's kind of what falls in the middle, kind of this adaptive game system. D&D, I think we've turned it into an adaptive game system, but I think the way that it was initially designed was more episodic in nature, and there are some hints at that in its design still to this day. But we, as fans of the system, have turned it into this in-between system that can be used for both, which is why I said D&D is a little different. Whereas if you look at like Legend of the Five Rings, there's this really weird transition that happens from first edition to second edition. First edition feels like it's episodic, like you should be doing vignettes. You're going to do a drama, and then you're done. You move on to the next clan, and you do the next thing. In second edition, it's like, no, you should pursue these goals. Your clans are going to go against each other. They're going to move, and they're going to take territories, and you're going to be part of the political embroilment that happens in the world. That stuff you can see if you pay attention to the way the writing is done. Ultimately, designers will tell you what they think their game is for if you listen.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of kind of diving in and looking at it. I certainly think that leveling, if there is such a thing, character advancement, is a solid way that I typically look at to determine whether or not a system would be better suited for running short-term or long-term.
It also lets you know what that game's all about. Like if you pick up a game off the shelf and you just look at how a character is advanced, that will tell you instantly what that game's about. Don't pay attention to the art. Don't read the section that says what this game's about. Literally just look at how characters advance, and you will understand how that game actually works. Yeah, especially the beginning and the end for characters. You know, that gives you the arc of, you know, the power spread for one, and you know what a top tier character and what a beginning character are supposed to look like, and the difference between them should give you a really good sense of kind of what you're dealing with, and potentially how long it's going to take to work there through all those steps. Awesome. All right, another one by Alan is it better to learn a new system through a campaign or a one-shot? Personally, my preference is to do a one-shot. I do what we call like a dry run or a beta test one-shot, that literally we are not doing anything with story. We just made some BS characters to try to make characters, and we're going to fight some random monster I found in whatever monster manual or made up off the top of my head, just so we can get an idea of how the game works. But almost immediately, the next one's going to either be a one-shot or a campaign. I don't typically record those on my channel because it's usually us at the height of chucklefuckery and meta talk, so it's not super good and entertaining to watch, but it is very valuable for players to do, and GMs for that matter.
I have a very difficult time sitting down with a book and really getting a good handle on the way a system works. That's just not the way that I learn. I can get information by sitting down and kind of thumbing through different sections that I think might apply.
Stuff that just doesn't come up until you actually engage.
Absolutely, yeah. Like grappling.
Yeah, like I'm trying to think of what's the best one. Burning Wheel, for example. Fantastic game. I have lots of great things to say about it, but the way these micro skirmishes happen, like how a fight happens, how social combat happens, you can read it and you can be like, this is fantastic. This is all I'm ever going to need for the rest of my life. As soon as you bring it out to play, you suddenly click those things in that you weren't really registering at first. And you're like, oh, okay, this is a little more complicated than I gave it credit for. Or, oh, this doesn't work the way I thought it did. In Burning Wheel's case, for anybody who's interested in looking at that one, it's usually, this is more complicated than I thought this was. But that's just kind of how that one goes. But yeah, like, you have to play with it. Like Star Wars, for example, is probably my biggest regret in the Fantasy Flight game series. I'm a big Star Wars fan, but I like the comic books more than I like the movies. So the FFG tabletop makes me feel like we're too underpowered for what I want. And I don't feel it's appropriate to start my characters and go, okay, you guys have 300 experience just to make you where I feel like we should be, because it feels like I'm going against the grain of that system. However, I can pick up Genesis, I can pick up Legend of the Five Rings, and I feel different about those systems because of my preconceived notions going into it. So, I mean, you got to feel them out. And like, I wouldn't have found that out about Star Wars unless we attempted a trilogy on the channel and literally crashed and burned 2 episodes in because we made a Jedi and tried to push against the limits the Edge of the Empire would provide us.
Yeah, I mean, it's pushing the edges of a system and finding the areas that your game system doesn't do well. I think is every bit as important as learning what it does do well.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think it's imperative. Awesome. Okay, moving right along. Another question by Alan. His last question that we have here. If you're wanting to spread awareness about a system that you love, but there aren't many people who know about it, should you run a series of one-shots to gather interest or future players? Oh, should you run a series of one-shot? Oh, wait a second.
Yeah.
Should you run a series or one-shots to gather interest in future players?
He said a series of one-shots, not or one-shots. But that would be my suggestion, is run... and this kind of goes back to that question that Barker said. I like tighter groups online. I've come to the conclusion that my favorite table size online is 3 players, a GM, and for 3 hours. I think that's my sweet spot for the skill set that I bring to the table. With that said, 3 hours is a really good increment to get people to try. It's not as committing as like a 4-hour game. People are a little bit more susceptible to it, or run like a 2-hour mini session. The best thing that I can say is like, run a part of the game that you think makes it interesting. So if combat's really cool, or magic is really cool, or investigating is really cool, do a series of one-shots about that mechanic. Let lots of people play it. The other thing that you can do is take my personal favorite. This is how I always sucker people into trying new stuff, is I take a product that a lot of people like, for example, Oath of the Frozen King. And I go, hey, it's Oath of the Frozen King, but we're playing Burning Wheel. And then you get people to buy in because they want the adventure of Oath of Frozen King, and they'll figure out Burning Wheel just to have that adventure. That is usually my sneaky trick number 1 to go to. Sneaky trick number 2 is get out there and talk to people. Find out what they're interested in. We used to do a lot of it, and it doesn't happen as much anymore. Just open hangouts. We've got a Discord. I encourage everybody to use either open hangouts or Discord, and just chit chat with each other, because you'll find that there are players that you've never considered for games that you've been wanting to play. And the only way you'll get that is if you engage with the group and try to like bring up and say, hey, I really love this game. Anybody interested in finding out a little bit more about it? Chepe from Von Trodden, originally no interest in L5R. After months and months of me talking about how L5R is the greatest game ever written, and going back and forth and kind of engaging with him about the types of things that he likes. Like, he's a very investigation driven character. And I was like, oh, there's this clan that's all about investigation, and they're kind of mystics, and they're weird. And he's like, really? They're weird? Like, bring in your players with sweets, if you would. Like, that's kind of the old way that we all did it when we were coming up in like the one-shot group and other Facebook groups and stuff like that, before we got a little bit more organized and some of us got channels and stuff like that going. That's really the main key, is like, establish your friendships first.
Yeah, I agree. And playing with friends is always a really good way to explore new systems.
Mm-hmm.
You're trying to do that with strangers, people you've never played with, is an incredibly daunting, first of all, and difficult thing to try to accomplish. But if you're comfortable with the people that you're playing with, then you don't have to be as comfortable with the system that you're running, and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. And to that, I will say that usually the way that I like to try a system, if I know someone's interested in it, is I'll find a player who is familiar with the system, at least to the same level that I am from reading the book and all that, to jump in as the GM. That way I've got like a second set of eyes, another person to remind me of a rule I forgot, my co-DM, if you would, on the rules, but I'll still maintain the story and take care of all that stuff. That's usually a good thing to go for, is like, say, for example, you're interested in index card RPG and you see somebody who's been posting a lot of index card RPG. If that person says they're interested in your game, make them the first person you add to your game. They're going to be a great asset. The other thing that happens when you do that is some players inside the groups want to play with certain people. That's kind of a reflection of kind of the social culture that we've built. If you add someone, chances are one of their friends may want to join as well. And their friend may be at the same knowledge level, or at least they may be more knowledgeable than someone else. And there's already a link that's established between those two players, which makes running the game a little easier too. Not to say that you should run for the same people all the time, but when you're trying a new one, it's probably a little easier for you if you run with people that know each other.
Yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. Excellent. Okay, so we have one more question from the people from AbTab, and this one comes from Taylor Jeffrey. You mentioned her earlier. Has your personal preference for one-shot versus campaign changed over time, or does it go back and forth?
Man, I mentioned it earlier. I'm a very eclectic GM. It has absolutely fluctuated with time, whether it's based on my availability, what my preferences are at the moment. And there's been times where they're at odds too. Like, I only have time for one shots, but I really, really want to run this campaign. And it hurts, but like the best thing to do in that case is just shelve your idea, revisit it later, run those one shots. Don't overstretch yourself for the campaign that probably won't work because of your timing. That's really the big thing. But like, yeah, no, each one of them has a special place in my little storyteller heart. And I want to tell all of them, ultimately. I want to engage with all the types of stories that I can do. I want to be able to engage with as many players as I can, whether they're viewers or players or whatever the case is. I want to try game styles that I haven't even tried before, like the idea of a major world event. WotC does them sometimes, where there's 20 players that are playing a part of the adventure, and what happens at their table affects the big thing that's happening inside the event. Like, I would love to do one of those as a GM, because I haven't had that chance yet. And like, I want to engage with all that stuff. And the more you play, I think the hobby fosters that. You either end up falling in love with it so deep that you're just like, I want to do all the things all the time, or you kind of fall out of it and you do something else for a while. But if you feel that you have that urge as a player and you have not tried GMing, it's probably time for you to step up and try and GM. And there's lots of people inside the group with lots of experience that would be willing to help you out, even if it's just bouncing some ideas off of you.
Yeah, I agree. And it's one of those things where I'm a firm believer that everybody who is a player should experience GMing at least once. And if you are typically a GM, you need to play at least once.
Yeah, I think for me, and this is tangential, the perfect balance for GMing is like one session at least each week I run as a GM, and then each week I sneak in one session as a player. I don't mind going past that. I don't typically want to get greedy and do a lot of play sessions, because I honestly really love the GM seat. Like, I'll run 5 GM sessions a week if my time allows it, but I've got to sneak in that one time as a player, because it's a different feeling in each seat, and it is worth exploring. Really, if you're a player and you've been playing for 6 months, you have a solid foundation on your system, you can GM. If you got a solid foundation before that 6 months, honestly, you could probably GM earlier. You could do like we did when we first learned, pick up the book, and one of you just goes, I guess I'll GM, because that's how a lot of us started. I mean, there's nothing intimidating about it, because ultimately, you're not going to be super stellar the first time you go out. You're going to have regrets as you go along, but you got to learn with each one of these one-shots, campaigns, mini sessions, whatever you want to call what you're doing. Each one of them is going to be foundational to who you are as GM. And for people who have been doing it for a long time, like yourself, myself, any of the guys inside, half the guys inside the groups, like, there's no end to that learning. Like, you find things as you go along, and you find new ways to engage with these stories, new ways to tell things that you didn't think about before. That's why it's so important to be a player too, because you're engaging with another GM who has different ideas, different approaches, and thinks about how they want to structure their story in a way that you may not have thought about yourself. And then the third thing that I'd recommend is, if you got a long drive ahead of you, find somebody on YouTube. I mean, ultimately, we are all kind of putting our stuff out there oftentimes it's more for us to have a recorded library so that we can reference back to our own games. But there's a lot of really good GMs and stories out there. I've listed a bunch. I'm a big believer in that you should kind of name other channels and stuff like that along the way. But yeah, if you see somebody who throws up a game that you're interested in, and let's say that it is L5R and you see my post, click on that thing, give it a listen. Maybe just from listening, you're able to tell, hey, this isn't the system for me. I don't like ninjas, whatever. You guys have fun, but at least you learn something along the way.
Yep, and knowing is half the battle. No joke. It's the second G.I. Joe reference. Yeah, man, it's one of those things where I still make mistakes all the time, even in the game systems that I know really, really well and that I'm very familiar with. I'll finish running a session and going, man, I shouldn't have done that. Or, I missed this one thing from my notes that I really wanted to be a part of there, but I got caught up in, the scene and I left it out. So, I mean, like, it's okay. It's okay to screw up. And especially if you take it as a learning experience, just like life, if you take the opportunity of being shown a different way of doing something, or a way that you hadn't thought of, or a way that you discover by accident, and work that into your repertoire just as much as you would a piece of historical information that you latch onto, then you're not going to get worse at doing this. You're only going to get better.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point too, is like, just be a fan of something and you'll do fine. You can take elements of anything and bring it into your game, even if it doesn't make sense to you at first. One of my favorite one-shots in Dragon Grin, I told a very classic noir story that initially, when you hear about Dragon Grin, you're like, I don't know if a noir would be great, but it was like a noir that ended in a tragedy, and it felt perfect for Dragon Grin. All the players had a blast with it, and that wouldn't have happened if I wasn't personally interested in that kind of story.
Yeah, and that goes back full circle to what we were talking about earlier about how, as the person running it, like, the passion has to start with you.
Yeah,
that's where the hearth fire has to be located. And if it's not, then it's going to end up feeling off, I think, in the long run. So, yeah. Well, I think that's about it, honestly. So I'll let you do any, outro or plug anything that you'd like to plug, and we'll put a bow on it.
Yeah. So I mentioned it. I run the channel DropDice. I do have a RPG that is in beta test right now. Uses the index card RPG system. It's called Xiaoyun. If you look at pretty much any of my new videos within the since December, basically, there's a link to the beta file. There are some typos in it, but it is a beta file. Bear with me as I work on it. But that's mostly what I do. I tend to focus on Oriental campaigns. It's just where my personal preference is. When I do European campaigns, I tend to run stuff that's a little bit closer towards political embroilment and things like that, which is kind of why I like L5R as much. If you have any interest in any game, chances are I've probably read or touched or been adjacent to it at some point. I'm usually a pretty good person to give you kind of a quick rundown of what something's about if you want an idea. You can always shoot me a message either on Facebook or on YouTube, asking me anything like that. I'm sometimes slow to respond, but I'll always respond.
Well, I sincerely appreciate you coming on and discussing, just a little bit of everything, honestly. But with the topic kind of being one-shots versus campaigns, I think there's a lot of great advice that you managed to squeeze in here. And I know that I certainly learned a couple of points that are things that I hadn't thought of before, or at least ways of putting it. It might have been rumbling around in the old brain pan, but I hadn't actually put it to words. So, yeah, I appreciate you coming on and agreeing to do this, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Whether you tune in live or whether you may be tuning in the future to give us a watch, I do appreciate that as well. And make sure to stick around. If this is the kind of thing you like, there's plenty more of it on the channel. There's another episode coming later on in the month where I will have DM Scotty on, and we will be discussing tangible tools at your table for your RPGs. In addition to that, there's also lots of live plays and other videos on the channel, so have a look around. And until next time, may your dice roll high and your snacks always be within reach.